Good morning and welcome. This is the final class in the series starting off before Passover with the theme of freedom. Now we come to the holiday of Shavuot, depending on your pronunciation. And this is the holiday that first and foremost celebrates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai 3,300, I think, and 36 years ago. I don't know why, but among Jewish holidays, Shavuot is probably the least observed amongst American Jews. American Jews have become very assimilated and lost touch with much of Jewish practice, unfortunately, tragically. But they still hold on to certain holidays. Passover, for example, the Seder is universally observed. Hanukkah is very popular, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. But Shavuot has lost some of its appeal, much of its appeal to westernized, assimilated Jews. I don't know the reason for it, maybe because there are not that many traditions and rituals associated with it as we do on Passover. Passover is a family holiday where everyone sits at the Seder with family, children are highlighted. But whatever the reason is, it's the biggest tragedy that you could imagine, because without Shavuot, there is no Judaism. There's zero Judaism. There's no Passover, there's no Hanukkah, there's no Rosh Hashanah, there's no Yom Kippur, there's no nothing. Because Shavuot is the anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, which is the foundation of all of Judaism. And it marks an event that is not just a significant event, but it is the most significant event in human history. There has never been, and there never will be, an event like the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And everything else revolves around it. So why is it that it was neglected and it lost its appeal? I leave that to others, to sociologists, to figure out, or any other area, any other disciplines that deal with this kind of issue, to figure it out. Now the name itself, Shavuot, which is the Ashkenazic pronunciation, in Israel they would pronounce it Shavuot, literally means weeks, the holiday of weeks. Why is it called the holiday of weeks? Because the Torah does not give us a date for this holiday. Passover, it says in the Torah, is the 15th of the month of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah is the 1st of the 7th month. Yom Kippur is the 10th day of the 7th month. Sukkot is the 15th day of the 7th month. But it doesn't say when to observe Shavuot by the day of the month, or even the month. What it says is that when you celebrate Passover, on the second day of Passover, you start counting the days and weeks. And after 7 weeks of counting, that's when we celebrate this holiday. So that's why it's called the holiday of weeks. But that sounds like a pretty weak reason to give it a name, a holiday of weeks, when it has nothing to do with, it's the holiday when we got the Torah. So it is, we do use that phrase in our prayers, Zman Matan Toratenu, which is the season of the giving of our Torah. But the colloquial and also in the scholarly sources, the holiday is mostly known as Shavuot, the holiday of weeks, because you don't have Passover, you don't have Shavuot rather, without weeks that go from Passover to Shavuot. Because the whole idea of Shavuot is that it is the extension of and the completion of Passover. As we discussed earlier in the series of classes about freedom, that the Jewish people were not free in the full sense of the word just by leaving Egyptian bondage. You could be a free person, you have no master over you, but you're still very much a slave to whatever it is. It could be addictions, it could be slaves to your evil inclination, it could be all sorts of slavery that you would never refer to as slavery, but for all intents and purposes, it's no different from slavery. So the Jewish people did not really experience complete freedom until the holiday of Shavuot, when they received the Torah at Mount Sinai. And that's why the Torah doesn't tell you which day of the month, because it's not a separate holiday, it's a connection. It's connected to, it's an extension of Passover. Because what is the definition of freedom? Definition of freedom is not what 99% of people would say is the definition of freedom. The definition of freedom, people would say, if the government doesn't dictate to me how I should live my life, which happens not to be true. The government does dictate our lives, but there are different degrees of how it dictates. If you're living in a totalitarian regime, they dictate everything. If you live in a democratic country like the United States, they don't dictate everything, but they dictate enough to make us realize that we're living under the leadership of this particular country. So what does true freedom mean? True freedom means that you're able to live in accordance with your innermost, most essential purpose of your existence. When you recognize that what you think you want is not really what your soul wants. And who are you? Who are we? We are our soul. Yes, the soul is in a body, and the body has its interests. But if you allow the body to lead the soul is not free. The soul is in prison. So what is true freedom? True freedom is when you're allowing your soul to express its will, its desires, its passion, unhampered by the interests of the body and the animal soul. Take, for example, a little child, a 2-year-old child, runs into the street to catch a ball. And you tell the child, no, don't do it. And then you grab the child and protect it from being hurt. The child feels that you have compromised his freedom. He wants to go into the road and you're not letting him. Are you going to say the child is not free? No, the child is free if you don't allow it to do what it wants. Yes?
Rabbi, do we consider the human mind more a part of the body or part of the soul?
The human mind is a physical entity, and it houses both the godly soul and the animal soul. They are both contained within the mind, within consciousness. So when you deprive the child from what it wants, it sounds like you're depriving it of its freedom. But it's not true. It's inner. If you can converse with a child's soul, the soul would say, thank you for saving my life, and thank you for not letting me do what I wanted to do. So freedom is not defined by what you think you want, but what you know you want based on the inner workings of your soul, of your neshama. In Ethics of the Fathers, in the other class we did this week, it says when the Torah talks about the tablets, it says the tablets were charus al haluchos. Charus means engraved. But the word charus, since the Torah doesn't have vowels, you could read that same word as cherus, freedom. The only person who was free is the one who's engaged in the study of Torah. Why? Because true freedom means to do what your soul wants to do. And since the Torah is engraved in us, it's part of who we are, anything that a person wants to do, that a Jew in particular wants to do, that is contrary to what the Torah says, it's contrary to who we are. When did that happen? That happened when God gave us the 10 Commandments. The truth is, I mentioned this hundreds of times, there's no such thing as 10 Commandments. That's a misnomer. The Torah refers to 10 statements. And if you count the number of commandments in those 10 statements, there are about 13 different opinions as to how to categorize commandments. And the total number of commandments in the Torah is 613. So it's 10 statements. But what's the difference between a statement and a commandment? If I command you to do something, I am trying to impose my will on you, and you will either say, okay, I'll do it. If I can instill enough fear in all of you, no more lox if you don't do what I say, no more bagels and lox, then you'll do it. But if I don't have that capacity to instill fear, you won't do it. When you make a statement, a declaration, you're saying, this is who you are. When God says, as he opens up the 10 statements, I am God, your God, God is saying, I have made myself present within you. You are now a nation that has as its essential existence the desire to follow the dictates of the Torah. So when a Jew does something and it seems like he's going against his own will, a Jew says, I would want to buy the cheeseburger, but I'm not going to buy it because I was commanded not to eat milk and meat. So you think you're going against your own desire. No, you're conforming to your true desire. That's what you really want. You don't want that cheeseburger, unless it's artificial cheese and the meat is kosher. But otherwise, you really don't want it. If the Torah tells you not to steal, and you really want to steal, you really would like to take something that doesn't belong to you, and you restrict yourself, you really force yourself not to do it, you're not fighting against yourself, you're conforming to who you are. That's who you really are. That's what happened at Mount Sinai. That's why we make such a big fuss about Mount Sinai. What really changed? It says there, don't commit murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Those were laws that existed before Sinai. Those existed before. So what changed? What changed is not that the laws were new. Those are basic fundamental laws that were given to Adam and later on to Noah. But what's new is that this became the nature, the intrinsic nature of every one of us, that we want to do God's will. But how come we don't feel that way? Because we're not free. Our soul is not free. When God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, he liberated our soul, and momentarily at least, during that experience, their souls were totally in touch with God's will. And that became the essential nature of every one of us. And we have to work in revealing that inner nature. We don't have to change who we are. We have to reveal who we are. Now, when the Jewish people were approached with the Torah, they said in Hebrew the famous two words, Nasa v'nishma. Nasa means we will do it, and v'nishma means we will hear, we will listen. In other words, that they said was, God, I don't care what it is that you want us to do. Whatever you want us to do, we will do. And later on, we'll hear what you want us to do. As opposed to most people would have responded, and as the Midrash tells us that other nations of the world were also approached with the Torah, and they said, Nishma, let us hear what it's about. And if they didn't like every law, they rejected it. The Jewish people said, we will do it. And then they said, we'll hear what it's about. So they were very eager to get the Torah. But there's a little problem. The Talmud tells us that when God was ready to give them the Torah, he took Mount Sinai and he suspended it over the heads of the Jewish people, and he said, if you accept the Torah, great, fine. If you don't, I'm going to drop the mountain on you. That's where you will be buried. I will destroy you. How do you reconcile these two sources? The question is asked by many of the commentators. I'll give you first the Hasidic answer, then I'll give you the earlier answer that was given. The Hasidic answer is that it doesn't mean literally that God threatened to kill them if they don't accept the Torah. But what God meant was, I've shown you so much love. The mountain is a metaphor for love. It overwhelms you. I have showered you with so much love. I performed all these miracles for you. I have shown you how close I am to you. Will you accept the Torah? And when they said yes, did they have a choice? If someone does so much for you, gives you so much of anything that you need, and asks you for a favor, will you say no to them? That's not really called acceptance of the Torah. That's called you were coerced. You were forced into it. Not forced by the threat of destruction, but forced by the threat of being an ingrate. God gives you so much, how could you say no? That's the Hasidic approach to this question. But earlier sources give this a different answer. The Torah is divided into two parts. There's what we call the Written Torah, Torah Shebiktav, and there's Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Oral Torah. What does that mean? We discussed this many times, but I think it's important to rehash this. When you read the 5 books of Moses, with all of its commandments, 613, could a person say, I will follow the Torah to the letter? Whatever the Torah tells me to do, I will do. The answer is no, you couldn't do that. Why? Because the Torah was written in code. It's so cryptic. I'll give you a few examples. When the Torah says on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to do malacha, which we translate as work. That's the English translation, but a translation is never an adequate commentary. What does it mean that you can't do work on Shabbos? It doesn't say in the Torah. It just says don't do malacha. And it doesn't just say it, it says if you do, you'll incur punishment for it. But if you don't know what it is that you're not supposed to do, how could you be told that you better do it or else? And the answer is, while it doesn't say it in the Torah, in the written Torah, when Moses was on Mount Sinai, and he got the Oral Torah as well, which defined malacha as referring to 39 categories of work, like writing, like planting things, like lighting a fire, like building, and I'm not going to go through all 39, but those are the definition of work. What about schlepping? That's an English word, by the way. What about schlepping a heavy load from the basement all the way up to the attic? While it's not in the spirit of Shabbos, and many will say it's also against the spirit of Shabbos, and it's against Jewish law, but it's not a violation of doing work. Doing work is defined by 39 categories, not by what we think is hard work. A person could go to work in his office on Shabbat and technically not violate the Shabbat if they don't do the things that are concluded in the 39 categories. Rabbis give sermons on Shabbos, and they get paid, hopefully, for their work. Now, are they working on Shabbos? Well, and if some people would define it, yes, they're working on Shabbos because they're doing their job on Shabbos and they're getting paid for it. But that's not called work. Work is defined very narrowly. But how do we know that? That was all transmitted in the Oral Torah. Another example, it says in the holiday of Sukkot, you're supposed to take, among other things, a beautiful fruit. Now, if I threw this question out to the whole class here, how do you define a beautiful fruit? I'm sure we'd come up with very different answers. What do you call a beautiful fruit, subjectively? An apple? Avocado? A peach? Strawberry? I mean, they're all beautiful. Everything in God's world is beautiful, but that's not what the Torah is referring to. It refers to an esrog, a lemon-like fruit that grows in the Mediterranean, grows in Israel, grows in Italy, and grows in Greece. You can even grow it in Florida or California. It's not a very common fruit. It looks like a lemon, but it's not a lemon. And that's what we're taking for 3,000 plus years. But it doesn't say that in the Torah, because we knew that it was transmitted in the oral law, that fruit refers to the esrog, a fruit that has certain characteristics that make it called beautiful. Torah says that if someone takes out your eye, the punishment is an eye for an eye. Is there any record of any Jewish court that ever punished someone by taking out an eye or a tooth for a tooth? Never happened. Why? Because the Oral Torah says it doesn't mean literally. It means the value of the eye for the eye. You pay compensation for the loss of the eye. And this is just few of the, I'll give you another example, not from a law. When the Torah talks about Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve had a child called Cain, and Cain got married and he had children. Who did Cain marry? Doesn't say in the Torah. There was no other women around, except for his mother. Doesn't say who he married. Well, the Oral Torah says we know who he married. He was born, as did his brother Hevel, with twin sisters, and they married their twin sisters. Now, you're not allowed to marry your sister, even if she's not a twin, but in those days, the only way to procreate was marrying a sister, and that was acceptable in those days. Later on, it became forbidden. But it's not in the Torah. The Torah doesn't tell you this information, and I can go on. Virtually every section of the Torah is unintelligible without the Oral Torah. Now, when the Jewish people said, we'll do everything you tell us, they were referring to the Written Torah. They didn't mind following a manual a manual that says do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. But the Oral Torah is different. The Oral Torah, in addition to clarifying what the Written Torah is about, it's the way we are able to deal with new situations. As technology advances, how do we answer questions that only modern technology has raised? For example, surrogate motherhood. How do we know who's the real mother? The mother who contributes the egg donor, or is it the one who carries the baby and gives birth to the baby? This is being debated now, but how? Based on what? Based on your own feelings? No, you can't base anything on your own feelings in Judaism. Your own feelings have zero value in terms of what Jewish law says about how to live your life. Your own feelings could just make you more excited about it, but it doesn't really contribute to how you behave. The oral law is not only the interpretation of the biblical laws, but it also gives you the methodology. It gives you the way to take the precedent and apply it to new situations, similar, not identical, but similar to the way courts will interpret, the Supreme Court, the Constitution. The Constitution is a written document, but there's also how you read between the lines, and that's what the Supreme Court has to decide, what precedents apply to this new developing situations. So the oral law is a whole system, not just of defining the biblical laws, but also giving you the ability to apply laws to every situation. And that's what makes Judaism, on one hand, dynamic, and it also makes it challenging. It would be much easier for people who have slave mentality. They say, look, just tell me what I have to do, A to Z, and I'll do it. I'm not interested in struggling to figure out what I have to do. But that's part of the oral tradition, the Oral Torah tradition of working, using your mind to figure out what exactly does God want from me based on the precedents, based on earlier interpretations. The Jewish people were more than eager to accept the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. And throughout Jewish history, breakaway movements, what did they do? How did they break away? The Sadducees, for example. The Sadducees lived in the times of the Second Temple. And they broke away from Judaism. In what way? They said, we believe in the Bible, in the written Torah. That's divine. That comes from God. We don't believe in the oral Torah. And they broke away thereby from Judaism, and there's nothing left of them. There are no heirs, people who say, I'm a Sadducee, my father was a Sadducee, my grandfather was one, my great-grandfather was one. That ended, because once you break away from Torah in its completeness, you're essentially opening yourself to assimilation. Later on, in the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries, you had the Karaites who did the same thing. They broke away from traditional Judaism. They didn't accept the oral Torah. And that's what happened throughout Jewish history. The oral Torah was maligned. Later on, the oral Torah, by the way, was put into writing in the Talmud and other rabbinic works. And it's interesting, the anti-Semites throughout history, especially in medieval times, what did they oppose? They didn't oppose the Bible, the written Torah. In fact, they studied it themselves and they based their religion on it. What did they attack? The Talmud. If you read all the anti-Semitic material literature, from the neo-Nazis to the Islamic fundamentalists to Christian fundamentalists, what did they attack? They attacked the Talmud. In medieval times, they took the handwritten Talmuds, there was no printing in those days, and they consigned it all to the flames. This was the greatest threat to them, or this was the strength of Judaism. As soon as the oral Torah was challenged, Judaism itself was challenged. So what happened at Mount Sinai, what God had to impose upon them, was to accept the oral tradition. And there's a special connection to Shavuot. In the Torah, it doesn't say, as I mentioned, what day of the month you observe Shavuot. It says you count 50 days or 7 weeks, and the 50th day is Shavuot, from Passover. From what day of Passover? From the second day of Passover. Why the second day? Because the Torah says that on the day after the Sabbath, you start counting the days. Now, the word Sabbath is a generic word. It doesn't necessarily mean the 7th day of the week, Saturday, which is Sabbath. It means the day of rest. So the Sadducees said it refers to the first Sunday of the Passover season. When do you start counting? You start counting, if let's say Passover is a Tuesday, you wait till Saturday, and Saturday and night you start counting the days. But the rabbis, based on the oral tradition, says, no, it doesn't mean Saturday night. It means the day after Passover. Passover is also called Sabbath. That's how the oral tradition interpreted it. And when they used to cut the grain for the omer was the barley offering from which you started counting, they made a lot of fanfare about it. Why? To underscore the truth, the validity of the oral tradition that says you start counting the day after Passover. So the whole holiday of Shavuos highlights and underscores fidelity to the oral tradition. And this has a connection also to another event that we commemorate on Shavuos. Something else happened historically on Shavuos, and that was the passing of King David. Now, King David was a controversial figure, and he was maligned by all of his critics. Why was he attacked? Because King David was a great grandson of Ruth. Ruth was the woman from the Moabite nation, princess of a Moabite princess, who converted to Judaism. She married a Jewish leader whose name was Boaz, and their great grandson was David. What was the problem? The problem was that in the Torah it says you're not allowed to marry a Moabite, even if they convert to Judaism. Moabites were not our friends, to put it mildly. And the Torah says you cannot marry a Moabite. The fact that King David's ancestor was a Moabite princess meant that her offspring was not kosher, and a Jew could not marry her offspring. And therefore King David was illegitimate. Illegitimate as a private person. Certainly he was disqualified to be the king. And his whole life he was maligned by everyone who attacked him. King David had a very difficult life. If you read the book of Psalms, you read about how his enemies wanted to destroy him in every which way. But what is the reason that he was accepted? Because there was an oral tradition that the biblical prohibition of marrying a Moabite referred to a Moabite man, not a Moabite woman. That if a Jewish woman marries a Moabite man who converts to Judaism, that marriage is illegitimate. But if a Jewish man marries a Moabite woman who converts to Judaism, that's totally legal and kosher. And therefore King David was accepted. Which means that King David's acceptance, again, reinforces our commitment to the oral tradition. Because without the oral tradition, King David would be gone. We would have no King David. If we wouldn't have a King David, we wouldn't have his descendant, who is the Mashiach, who brings the world to its completion, who redeems the Jewish people and brings peace to the whole world. All of that starts with King David. He was the one who planted the seeds for the future redemption. And all of King David's status depends on fidelity to the oral tradition. And that's one of the reasons we read, many people have a custom to publicly read the Book of Ruth on Shavuos. Why the Book of Ruth? So there are many reasons given, but one of the reasons is that it is the book that establishes the validity of the oral tradition, which made King David's role totally acceptable. Yes?
Why don't we read the Book of Tefillin?
Many people do. Not everyone reads the Book of Ruth. Chabad custom, we don't read the Book of Ruth publicly. We say it the night of Shavuos. We recite many selections of the Torah and we read the whole Book of Ruth. But that's not done publicly. So there are different customs about that. But the Book of Ruth is connected to Shavuos. Main reason given, because of her ancestry. She was the great-grandmother of King David, as it's mentioned in the end of the Book of Ruth.
Can you explain why you are allowed to marry Jews?
My wife is asking me a difficult question. Why is it, what's the distinction between marrying a Moabite man or a Moabite woman? Because the Torah gives a reason why you shouldn't marry a Moabite, because when you were traveling through the desert, and we went through the area that belonged to Moab, instead of showing us hospitality, and that region of the world is known for hospitality, they didn't greet us with any bread or any water. They tried to starve us, preventing us from having any hospitality. And because of that, they demonstrate a certain amount of cruelty. God did not want we should mingle with people who are so insensitive and cruel and not grateful. So the Talmud says, but that only referred to the men, because in those days, women would not be the ones to go out unless they were interested in something else. The women would always maintain their privacy, and they would not go out to greet strangers and visitors and guests. So we couldn't hold anything against the women. The women did not do anything wrong. It's the men that did everything wrong. Yeah.
So, does that still stand today then? And what area of the world is that?
Moab doesn't exist anymore. The Talmud makes it clear that all the restrictions in the Torah against marrying a Moabite, against marrying an Egyptian until the third generation, those no longer apply. Why? Because when the Assyrian emperor, known as Sancherib, came, what he did is he mixed up everyone. He took people from one region and he brought them to another country. So there's nobody you could say is a descendant of Moab. There's no one who can make that claim. So when you marry someone, the odds are that he's not from Moab. So you can marry that person as long as they convert to Judaism. What else? What other reason is there for reading the Book of Ruth on Shavuos? Ruth was a convert to Judaism. And Judaism puts a great emphasis on the virtue of converts who are sincere about their conversion. But what does it have to do with Shavuos? Because, what? Because that's what happened on Shavuos. We all became converts. Before we got the Torah at Mount Sinai, we were just a nation among nations. We had special distinction. We were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the status of being Jewish didn't start until we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. And in fact, the Talmud, when it discusses the laws of conversion, base it on the experiences of the Jews in the desert when they received the Torah. So the whole Jewish people became converts at the time the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. Now, when I say the Torah was given, I want to just clarify something. On Shavuos itself, what happened? What exactly happened? They heard God declare the 10 statements, known as the 10 Commandments. But what about the rest of the Torah? Well, then that's when Moses went up on the mountain, and he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. And after watching all the reruns, he had nothing else to do, so God filled him in on all the different information about the Torah. He gave him the whole balance of Torah. And then he went up for another 40 days and another 40 days because of the golden calf. So Moses got all the knowledge, all the oral traditions, in addition to the written text. He got it at Mount Sinai after God declared these 10 statements. But our sages tell us that in these 10 statements, implicit in them is everything else. It's just like a seed. The seed looks like a little kernel, but that seed has the potential for the tree with all of its fruits and all of the fruits that will grow henceforth. Same thing with it. Those 10 statements represent the very kernel of divine knowledge that contains all the information that will ever be revealed in terms of its connection to the 10 Commandments, to those 10 statements. Another reason we read the Book of Ruth on Shavuos, and this is a very important reason. They're all important, but this one is, Ruth is all about kindness. It's about the kindness displayed to her by her mother-in-law, Naomi. It's the kindness that Boaz demonstrated to her. It's all about kindness. And the Torah is referred to as a Torah of kindness in the book of Proverbs. The Torah focuses on kindness. When we got the Torah at Mount Sinai, it took the idea of kindness to way above the conventional idea of kindness. And that's why you'll find throughout history, and especially in modern times, you see this clearly, at the forefront of every movement that is devoted to helping people, whether we like those movements or we hate them because they're misguided, but they're all based on the idea we have to help others. We have to be kind. Sometimes they'll use it to murder people in their distorted way of thinking, but we have to recognize, when I came to Buffalo and I was on UB campus in 1972, you had students who were running all the different organizations there that were either communist or out for the environment or out for to help the Attica brothers and every other movement designed to help people. Who were the people running these, manning these tables? 9 out of 10 were Jews. And that's not an accident, because that's how it has been. And it gets us in a lot of trouble, because sometimes we take it like Jews were very much instrumental in the Soviet Union. Of all places, you want to create a communist system that discriminates against Jews and murdered tens of thousands of Jews and imprisoned who knows how many hundreds of thousands because they were observant, as they practiced Judaism. But what we see over there is that whether they're right or wrong, they're motivated by a desire we have to do something to help society. The same thing what's going on today, demonstrations. You have Jews involved in demonstrating for the destruction and murder of millions of Jews. But it's motivated by, I have to do something to help people, misguided in the extreme. But that concept of kindness, where did it all begin? It began with Abraham, actually. But where did it really take root? And it became an integral part of the Jewish consciousness. That took place at Mount Sinai. And the Book of Ruth is a reflection of that obsession with kindness. So what really happened at Mount Sinai? I just told you what happened, but what really happened? So the mystical teachings of Judaism tell us that before Sinai, there was a dichotomy. And it uses a parable. There were two cities. It uses the term Rome and Syria. Rome is on the mountain, and Syria is in the valley. And they were enemies, bitter enemies. So the king of the Romans said, nobody is allowed to travel to Syria, to the valley. The leader of Syria said the same thing. Nobody who lives here is allowed to travel up the mountain. And then one day, they decided to make peace, and the decree was rescinded. And anyone who lived in the mountain, the Romans, could go down to Syria. The Syrians can go up to the mountains as well. And the Midrash says the same thing happened before the Torah was given. God created a dichotomy. There's the heaven, the spiritual, and there's the physical. The two will never meet. You cannot make a physical existence spiritual. You could develop your spirituality. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did that. They developed their spirituality, and they reached the extreme level of spirituality, but they couldn't change the physical world. They couldn't make the physical world holy and divine because of that dichotomy, because of that decree. At Mount Sinai, God removed that decree, and he says, I'll begin. And God descends on Mount Sinai. It doesn't say God took Mount Sinai and brought it up to him. It says God descended. Now, God is not up there or down there. God is not spatial. But what it means is that God, who is beyond, and the spiritual world is beyond the physical world, God allowed the spiritual and the physical to meet, created a synthesis between the two. And that's what Judaism is all about. Judaism is about taking the physical world, not running away from it, not escaping the physical world, but taking the physical world and creating a vehicle for God to be present in that physical existence. So, for example, when a man who puts on tefillin, what is he doing? He's taking a piece of leather, something from an animal, something very physical, very material, and he's turning that into a vehicle to connect to God. So he's bringing God into the physical world. And you put the tefillin on your arm and on your head, so you're actually bringing the divine into your physical body. And that's why Judaism puts a tremendous emphasis on the spirituality of the body, not just the soul. The body starts off very raw and very imperfect and unrefined, but through every mitzvah we make the body holy and we make the world around us holy. To the point when if we do enough mitzvahs, when we have critical mass, the whole world changes. And that's what the Messianic age is all about. When all of the mitzvahs that we do in their aggregate change the world indefinitely, and we have a perfect world, an ideal world. That explains, the Rebbe once explained at length, there's a custom that the night of Shavuot, this is going to be Tuesday night, people are up all night studying Torah or reading selections from the Torah. What is the reason for that custom? So the reason given is that when God came to give the Torah, let's say it was scheduled for 9 a.m., everyone was sleeping. No one was up. And they had to go waking people up to get them to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. And not only that, it says that their sleep was very sweet. Even a mosquito didn't bite. All of nature just assisted them in their tranquility and their peaceful sleep. So the Rebbe asked the question, the Jewish people were so eager to receive the Torah that they actually counted the days. That's one of the reasons we count the days between Passover and Shavuos. Why would they sleep and oversleep? If you were told that 9 o'clock in the morning, you're going to be presented with a Nobel Peace Prize, although I don't think the Nobel Peace Prize is really worth anything. It's a piece of garbage. But if you were offered something that you really value as a treasure, billions of dollars, and you have to be there at 9 o'clock, you wouldn't sleep all night. And if you slept, you would wake up early. So why did they fall asleep and they slept so peacefully they couldn't get up? So the Rebbe explains they didn't sleep because they were bored and they were not excited about it. They wanted to prepare for the Torah in the most spiritual way. And when you're asleep, your soul leaves your body to some extent, and your soul is able to absorb things that you can't get when your soul is in your body. That's why some great and holy people will get certain spiritual visions in their sleep. They can't get it when they're awake. Most prophets, besides Moses, could not get prophetic vision in their awakened state. They had to be in a state of sleep. Why? Because when you're asleep, your body doesn't impose itself. Your soul is more free to absorb spirituality. So they wanted to prepare for the Torah by being as spiritual as they can possibly be. And that's why the sleep was so peaceful, because their soul was in a state of tranquility, a state of bliss. But that was a mistake. That's why we have to correct it by being up all night, because the objective of Torah is not to escape. It's not to escape from this physical world. The objective of Torah is to bring the divine down into the physical world. Yes?
I want to go back to something before the written Torah and the oral Torah. Written Torah, written by God, is infallible. It's perfect. It's perfect. Nevertheless, as like the Constitution, but on a different level, it needs to fit the modern world, and you need to make, certain kinds of interpretations. So the interpretations in the Oral Torah are made by presumably sages, the brilliant people who have the best intentions, but nevertheless, they're human beings. They're fallible.
Absolutely.
They make errors. They don't know. They're using their best judgments.
Okay, I got the question.
So the oral Torah needs to not be considered at a level of the written Torah. It needs to be there, but it's written by men and women, but mostly by men also.
Okay, we get the question. It's a very good question. There's no question that on a certain level, the written Torah is considered holier than the oral Torahs contained in the Talmud. For example, I'll give you there's a law. many people don't know this, that if you have a few books and you want to pile them up, you cannot put a book of lesser holiness on top of a book of more holiness. I can't put a volume of the Talmud on a book of the 5 books of Moses. Why? Precisely because of what you said. The 5 books of Moses were dictated to Moses by God word for word, letter for letter. Whereas the Talmud were the ideas that were transmitted, but not necessarily word for word. The ideas were transmitted in the language of the people who spoke, and there are differences of agreement. So that's definitely true. But there's another point over here. If I am God, big if.
You're not. Now, I want to
No,
remind
no.
you and the rabbis that you're not.
We're not God. But if I would be God, and I tell you, I want you to make a decision on a certain matter. I'm leaving it to you, your judgment. Just follow my guidelines. And you come up with an answer. Now, if I'm not God, and I'm just some mortal, and I tell you that, and your answer is wrong, you can't blame the person who gave you the material or gave you the mission, the assignment, because I don't know how you're going to think. I don't know how you're going to draw conclusions. But if God tells you to figure it out and you're wrong, that's still God's will because you did everything you're supposed to do. That's why the Talmud says about the disputes between Hillel and Shammai, they are both the word of the living God. We can only follow one. The school of Shammai's opinions were rejected because the majority voted against them. But they're both the word of God, because if God tells people to use this methodology, these premises, and draw conclusions, that was God's will that they come to those conclusions, because God knows what human beings are capable of or incapable of. He knows that we're fallible. That's why there's a tractate in the Talmud that's devoted to the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of the Judaism, making mistakes and how they have to atone for it. No one is saying that everything that every rabbi said was right in the full sense of the word. It means it's still God's will, and we have to figure out which opinion to follow, and there are rules about that as well.
Right. And I understand that. God let himself be bound by giving us free will, which was a big risk.
This is not just free will.
A big risk on his part to have faith in us. Even though we've screwed it up, he's had faith in us to do it. And he took that risk, and he committed to that. That's why he knew what
You're confusing free will.
He was going to do, and yet he didn't stop.
Right, but you're mixing up two things. Free will is about whether I can do good or evil. The rabbis were not charged with deciding good or evil. They were deciding what is the good. Should we do it this way or do it this way? Should we light one candle the first night of Hanukkah and then add on another one, as the school of Hillel said? Or should we start with 8 and go downhill?
I fully get that, and I accept that. Nevertheless, when the audience, looks at what the rabbis have said in regard to the Oral Torah, people must keep in mind that is the law, because God agreed to that. At the same time, people need to understand that is the law, but that's been written by man.
So what?
And it has fallibility
So
in
what?
a way that the written Torah does not.
We already conceded that, but the point is that it's just as much. If you want to know what is God's will is to follow the people who were entrusted with the responsibility of interpreting the Torah and applying it to new situations. So number one, even the odds are that they're right, but even if they're wrong, they're not as if they did something negative. Just you have to go realize that was a mistake, as the rabbis themselves will admit. I don't know any rabbi, actually I know one prominent rabbi, I'm not going to mention any names, but I don't know one rabbi worth his salt. I mean, they're talking about the most accepted authorities who didn't admit later on in their lives that what I wrote 10 years ago, 20 years ago was a mistake. I only know of one contemporary authority who's very highly respected, who, as far as I can tell, never retracted any of his opinions. And I'm saying that not as a praise, that's why I'm not mentioning his name. It's not a praise, it's a criticism. But everyone else was willing to change. And God says, you followed the rabbi when he made the mistake, that was the right thing for you to do. And now that he corrected himself, that's the right thing for you to do. So, but if you're asking what are God's words, those are the words in the Torah, in the written Torah. What is God's will? God's will is the Torah that is the oral Torah that uses the principles that God gave us and applies them to new situations. So to conclude, we have a custom, as I mentioned before, to eat dairy foods on Shavuot. Why do we eat dairy foods? Because on a holiday you're supposed to eat a meat meal if you like meat. Judaism is not a vegetarian religion, although I know there are some rabbis who say that ultimately we will no longer be eating meat in the Messianic age. I have a problem with that conclusion because that means that how do we observe the Passover? Passover, the integral part of Passover is the Paschal lamb. But I'm not going to get into that subject right now. But every holiday we eat a meat meal. On Shavuos we're supposed to eat a dairy meal. Not a dairy meal and then eat a meat meal, if you still have room. Because cheesecakes do fill. Why do we eat dairy? There are many, many reasons given. In one of my books, I collected 40 reasons for it. And someone told me that someone wrote a book that had much more than that. So there's a lot of reasons. But one reason is that when the people were prepared to get the Torah, they knew that their dietary practices will change. They're not going to be able to use their utensils for meat because they were not kosher, because they didn't have to keep kosher before Sinai. So they had to eat dairy. That's one explanation given. Another explanation given is that milk, Torah is likened to milk. The word milk in Hebrew, chalav, numerically adds up to 40. We were like little children, like little babies. We converted to Judaism, it's like a new life, and babies are nurtured by milk. But I'll conclude with a very interesting explanation. And this is based on the Talmud and Midrash. When Moses went up on the mountain to get the Torah, the angels protested. And they said to God, why are you giving the Torah to a lowly human being? Give it to us. So in the Talmud, the version is as follows. God says to Moses, Moses, you defend yourself. You're on your own. That's another example of God is telling him the oral Torah is about you using your own brains to figure out what my will is. And Moses cross-examines them like a good lawyer, and he says, it says in the 10 Commandments, I am the God who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Were you slaves in Egypt? No. It says don't honor your father and mother. Do any of you have parents? No. Don't commit murder. Did any of you ever think about killing another angel? No. So what do you need it for? And that's how Moses won the battle with the angels. But in the Midrash, there's another version. And the version goes like this. The angels were asked, do you remember a few hundred years ago, you were visiting the house of Abraham? Yes, we remember that. We were disguised as people, but we were angels. And what did Abraham feed you? Oh, he fed us cheese, and he fed us meat, and you ate both of them. Yes, so you ate milk and meat together. So when you had an opportunity to observe the laws, you didn't keep it. And now you want them? Now you want the Torah? It's not for you. So because we got the Torah based on Moses' argument that the angels were not qualified to receive the Torah because they hadn't kept it when they had the opportunity to keep it, that's why we eat 2 meals, a dairy meal, and then we wait, and then we eat a meat meal, because the law is that you can't eat dairy after meat. You have to wait 6 hours, and German Jews... What? You cannot eat dairy after meat. You have to wait 6 hours. Some German Jews wait 3 hours, but you have to wait a few hours. But you could eat meat after dairy as long as you eat something in between that's neither, and you drink something in between. The custom is to wait a half hour or an hour between them, but you don't have to. So we eat a dairy meal, and then we wait and we eat a meat meal to show we are not like the angels. We respect that law of not mixing milk and meat. Now, one of the reasons why the Torah prohibits milk and meat, Maimonides writes in his Guide for the Perplexed, is because that was a custom of pagans. That was one of their rituals. They would cook a kid in the milk of its mother. So to distance ourselves from idolatry, we avoid any type of mixture of milk and meat. And so by remaining faithful to that law, that's our way of repudiating idol worship in every form. And that's why we would want to do it on Shavuot, because Shavuot is when we got the commandment, don't have any other gods. And therefore we show our respect for that law of rejecting idolatry by avoiding mixing milk and meat. Now, if you eat only dairy, it doesn't prove that you're observing the law. If you eat only meat, it doesn't show anything either. But if you eat both, and you do it with a way of the separation, it shows how faithful we are to this law. And these are just some of the reasons given, but there are dozens and dozens of reasons why the custom is to eat dairy. But I haven't found any Jew who rebels against Judaism in this area and refuses to eat cheesecake on Shavuot. Any questions? Yes?
Sometimes you think much harder work than physical. To think.
Thinking, yeah, but the Torah doesn't prohibit thinking.
Yes. So there's a song, sitzt am Buch und tracht und tracht und tracht die ganze Nacht. Can he do this on Shabbat?
Yes, he could. You could sing, and you could speak, and you could think.
No, I think, yes.
Yeah, thinking for sure. Otherwise, you'd have to sleep the whole Shabbos.
Can't think about it.
Even if you're a professional musician and you're practicing for a...
No, you can't play. We can't play music on Shabbos. You can think music. You could compose in your head. Yes.
You can eat anything,
What do you mean?
anything, a book,
You could read.
a theology report.
Yeah, you could. Although it's recommended to focus on spiritual readings on Shabbos, but there's no violation of doing work by reading a book of radiology.
So if we all is reading a book or reading a radiology report,
As long as you're not planning what you're going to do with that knowledge, but that's not called work. That's a lesson. In the laws of Shabbat, there are also rabbinical laws that you shouldn't even talk about. Tomorrow I'm going to go on a trip. You shouldn't even talk about what you're going to do tomorrow, unless it's a mitzvah. Unless you're talking about I'm going to help someone tomorrow, and you're making plans for that. That's all right. But if it's not that, but that's not called work. It's forbidden because of other considerations that the Shabbat should be devoted to non-weekday things, ideally.
what, let's say if my job is to check some antiques, and I would be watching those antiques during Shabbos.
Yeah,
Is that permitted?
As long as you're not planning what you're going to do, you're going to sell it, and how you're going to do something in the weekday based on what you're seeing on Shabbos. But if you're just out of curiosity, out of interest, you like to enjoy looking at antiques, there's nothing wrong with that.
So I can enjoy today,
Yeah,
but do something about it tomorrow.
right. Yeah.
One more question. What holiday celebrate Elimelech? The Rabbi Elimelech is geworden the Freilach.
Rabbi Melech was a Hasidic master, and he was always freilich. He was always happy.
What holiday he celebrate?
It doesn't, all the holidays.
No, because he called musicians. But on Shabbat and on holidays
Right,
he cannot call musicians.
But there are Hasidic holidays throughout, when a yard site, for example, the anniversary of a passing of a great person, Hasidim would get together and celebrate. So in the weekdays they would celebrate. Hasidim always celebrate.
Without musicians.
No, with me. They can have musicians also, as long as it's not Shabbos. All right.
But right now,
Shavuos is a holiday that we don't work, just like Shabbos. It's the same as Shabbos with one exception. You could cook on Shavuos, but you can't do all the other
on
things.
Rosh Hashanah, can we play?
No. All the.
Okay.
Just a
On
Let
Yom
me
Kippur,
tell you
of
the
course
days
we
you
can.
can play. You can't play on
What
Rosh
holiday
Hashanah,
we can play?
Hanukkah, Purim, and all the Hasidic holidays. The 19th of Kislev, the 12th of Tammuz, you can play then.
You play when the Beis Hamikdash is.
And when you play, it's a holiday.
Okay.
Yes.
Why is Shavuot
Thank you very much.
the
Can you
weeks?
put it
Because
on
it's 50 days.
It's both.
Yes.
It's both. It's both.
Yes.
It says in the Torah you should count 7 weeks, and it says count 50 days. So 7 weeks is 49 days, and the 50th day is the holiday.